Bill Gates was a university dropout who became one of the richest and most successful men in the world. At the height of his powers as the chief of Microsoft, he decided it was time to give something back and turned his attention to a philanthropic foundation that works to address poverty and disadvantage around the world. Bill Gates has given away half his multi-billion-dollar fortune, and even though he doesn't live and breathe computers anymore, he still has time to mentor some of the new generation, like Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg. Mr Gates is currently in Australia, and we sat down together in Canberra today. Bill Gates, lovely to meet you.
Great to be here.
What have you been lobbying Australian politicians for while you've been here?
Well, I've basically been sharing my experience, why my wife and I are giving our wealth away to help the poorest, to get vaccines out to them, to eradicate polio, to give them better seeds. And, you know, I get to go out in the field and see this, so I'm thanking Australians for their aid that goes to these efforts and encouraging them that the more generous they are, the more impact they'll have.
The Australian government and opposition are both committed to returning the Australian budget to surplus. It's currently in deficit, and aid targets have been allowed to slip a little as that goal is pursued. What do you say to that?
Well, I think the level 0.5% that both parties have been committed to, you know, leaves beside the 99.5%, and so I'd hope that the voters would choose to make that trade-off and help the poorest. After all, Australia is in a region with lots of developing countries, so whether it's for humanitarian reasons or security reasons or even just economic reasons, there's a lot to be said for Australia stepping up to the level that they've committed themselves to.
There might be some Australians who would feel that we have need at home in Australia, so why should taxpayer dollars be spent servicing need overseas instead of spent here? What do you say to that?
Well, when you're helping out the very poorest, whose children are dying in very large numbers, in many countries over 30%, you're able to save lives for only a few $1,000s per life saved. And so the impact per life is pretty unbelievable. And that's not the same domestically.
Why did you decide to shift your focus from your business career into philanthropy?
Well, I loved my work at Microsoft, but I decided that it was time to take those great resources and start giving them back in the most impactful way. It was an opportunity to work together with my wife, Melinda, to work on new areas of science. I felt there was a team that would take over at Microsoft, and so in my early 50s, this became my full-time work, and it's very fulfilling. I'm learning a lot. We're seeing great progress in many areas. So I'm quite lucky to have a second career that's as amazing as my first.
Giving away money is one thing. There's also the question of the tax that rich people pay. Warren Buffett, the CEO of Berkshire Hathaway, has said he thinks the rich should have to pay more tax. What do you say to that?
Well, I agree with Warren in 99% of all things, including that. You know, I paid over $6 billion in U.S. taxes. Glad to have done it. He's talking mostly about the U.S., which is the tax system he knows. But you know, in order to deal with all the medical cost demands and other challenges in the U.S., as we look at raising that revenue, the rich are going to have to pay proportionally slightly more. I think. You know, that's quite clear.
There was a hearing in Washington, DC last week looking at the tax arrangements for global tech companies. What obligation do you think companies have in terms of paying tax in the countries in which they're operating?
Well, most of the tax paid is the sales tax or value-added tax, and those are collected, and that's gigantic. There's also some type of profit tax, and that's where people are saying, do the way the laws look at those work the way that countries want them to? I don't think anyone's alleging that somebody's not following the rules. So, you know, the issue here is different tax authorities looking at the rules and seeing if it's the will of the government to change what those look like.
Do you believe in God?
I think there's some sort of God, yes.
Does it motivate you at all in what you do? Any sort of sense of Christian or other values?
I was brought up in the Christian church. I think the moral teachings are fantastic. We brought our kids up to believe those things. You know, the golden rule sort of captures the general spirit. And so yes, I think treating others well is kind of a universal value.
When you do work around the globe and you look at the influence of religion, do you see it as a help or a hindrance in terms of dealing with some of the major problems that you would see, such as reproductive health issues and population growth?
Well, that's a very broad question. I mean, you know, were the Crusades a good thing? Is, you know, sectarian strife between different religious groups a good thing? The moral teaching of almost all the religions about how we deal with each other are definitely something innate, something very helpful. When you get people together and you organize them, you look at, say, what the Catholic Church has done with relief services in many, many poor countries. There's that hugely positive thing. If you develop beliefs that are kind of us versus them, or you know, you say, hey, tools of reproductive health should never be used, that tends to cut the other way. And so it's very complex. You know, my wife believes in the Catholic Church, and yet she's chosen to speak up for contraception, which is against the hierarchy's belief. You know, so there's no simple answers.
When I put on Twitter that I was going to interview you, of course, even though you're not involved day to day in the running of Microsoft, people are always so keen to hear your views on tech issues. So I'll just quickly ask you a couple of things. One, are you on Facebook?
Yeah, I have a Facebook thing. People can connect up. I update things. I've got a Twitter account that I'm very active with.
Are you a gamer?
I play some games. I wouldn't consider myself like a hardcore best of breed type gamer.
What sort of games do you play?
You know, my family still plays a lot of cards. I play Bridge, which is a card game. I was just playing Bananagrams this weekend, which is a word type game. The number of new games that are out are pretty spectacular.
Would you dip a toe back into the water in any sort of startup yourself, or do you feel like your focus has moved?
Well, when I was in my 20s, I was fanatical. I just lived and breathed Microsoft. You know, weekdays, day, night, weekends, everything. You know, I'll never do that again because my foundation is my big central focus. I'm able to invest in some things in the energy space or biology space or different things that are interesting. But in terms of doing a startup myself, that's not my future.
Do you mentor any of the younger generation of tech leaders who've come up, Mark Zuckerberg and people like this?
Yeah, I've gotten to know Mark. I'd say you know, he learns from me. I learn from him. He's doing a lot of exciting stuff. So it's been fun to spend time with him.
When people think about the start of personal computing, they think Bill Gates, they think Steve Jobs. Did Steve Jobs' death cause you to reflect at all on your own mortality and on your own incredible accomplishments, what you've done and what you'd still like to do?
Well, I enjoyed being friends with Steve, competing with Steve. You know, Steve was an unbelievable person, and he and I spent a fair bit of time talking last year. There were 3 times that we got together, and I wrote him a long letter. And so it was a great tragedy for him to die. You know, he would have contributed a lot more. And yes, it reminds you that, you know, we're kind of not the young kids we were, and you know, that there's finite time ahead. So it was a sad thing.
Mr. Gates, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.